62.
In my brain, I was like, is she about to say 69? It doesn't make any
No,
sense. why
not
we would be on
yet.
69.
I don't have 69 on the spreadsheet yet. We haven't gotten that far. 69 will be right around Christmas, though. So win-win.
Lots of weird jokes we'll make then, making everybody uncomfortable.
Cursed pickles for everyone. That's what that is.
Oh, God. I loved that episode so much.
People who are listening backwards are going to be real confused.
That's just like one of my favorites. That was just a very fun episode.
It was super fun. Also, your outfit was a 10 out of 10.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I dressed up like Krampus.
Yep. It was adorable.
That was also great. Yeah, my horns.
So, yeah, this is episode 62 of The Bar's Ankle High. I'm Katie.
I'm Garrett. What are we talking about today?
So yeah, this comes out on October 19th. And as you heard, the past couple weeks, we've had our spooky music as our intro and outro music, spooky version.
My favorite things on the planet is that music.
Quick reminder, if you are subscribed to our Patreon, you can download that music and make it into your ringtone. And there's instructions on our Patreon on how to do that. It's a little bit easier if you have an Android, but it is possible if you have a iPhone as well, and the instructions are there. I recommend it. I have the Christmas one as my ringtone, and I will never change. So it's worth it. What a great way to wake up in the morning, honestly.
I would also like for it to be known that she is wearing a Christmas shirt.
I am wearing a Buddy the Elf shirt, and it says Raised by Elves, and it's the picture of him stuffing his face with his spaghetti and candy on it. Yep. But the important thing to note is that we're recording this in July, and my birthday's in December, and my partner apparently already got a birthday present for me. So I think I'm also justified in wearing whatever Christmas shit I want, because if you can get me birthday and Christmas gifts already, then I can wear my Christmas shit.
He texted me and I was like, it's July. How do you already have this taken care of? And he was like, oh, because I knew that if I saw it and I didn't take care of it right away, I would forget. And I was like, oh, I get that.
He's learning.
Yes. Because I was like, ADHD who?
Yeah, he showed me that part of the text because I was like doing the dishes and my hands were wet, and because I get home before him, so it was on the stoop, and so I knew he had gotten something, and it's something in a frame is what I can gather from the packaging. And so I was like, well, can I have it? And he was like, no, do you really want your birthday gift now? And I was like,
yes.
No. I want something to open in December on my birthday.
We play that game all the time. Like, I'll get something ahead of time and he'll realize that I have something ahead of time. What is it? Do you really want me to tell you? Or do you want to be surprised?
It is a real Russian roulette of impulsivity on what I answer to that question. For sure.
It is definitely like if he's having a bad day, totally. He wants to feel better. It's yes, I want to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, he got that so far ahead of time. I was like,
he told me, he was like, I'm gonna have to bring it to work so that you can't steal it. And I was like, first of all, I'm likely gonna forget that you even got it. Second of all, whatever. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I am an adult. Like, I don't need to peek at things anymore.
I stopped that last year.
Yeah, I worked on it really hard in therapy. So we did this around this time last year, and I thought it would be interesting and just like a fun kind of annual thing for us to do, but the history of another mental hospital, asylum, sanatorium, old-timey
nightmare fuel.
Yeah, old-timey hospital.
Last year we talked about the Willowbrook facility in Staten Island.
Yes, episode 13.
Oh my God.
I know.
Feels like a million years ago, but also last month.
Yeah, exactly. So do you have any guesses what we're talking about today?
Me?
Yeah, you.
I guess, yeah. Who else?
No,
who
the audience
would you be talking to? Jesus Christ. I'm also very deep into the third trimester and I'm struggling.
And let's hear from our audience.
Can I just say, so the other day, I had to move my desk at work, and I had a
I saw
box
that.
on my desk of stuff. And one of my coworkers is looking at the box and goes, "What is that?" So there was like a strange object in there, but also a bottle of Dawn. And I point to the bottle of Dawn. I was like, "This?" She was like, "No, not that. The other item." I was like, that makes a lot more sense. Good point.
Okay. So we are talking about the Pennhurst State School and Hospital. It's
Where?
located in Spring City, Pennsylvania. It's just outside Philadelphia.
Oh, no. Not familiar.
It's also like next door to a town called Pennhurst, hence the name.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And this, I think, will end up being 3 episodes.
Cool.
Because there's a lot. So in 1903, the Pennsylvania legislature authorized the creation of the Eastern State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic.
Oh, boy.
It was like colloquially called Pennhurst, and then later on its name got changed to Pennhurst State School and Hospital. Also, just a note, because this is so old, a lot of the verbiage used is really outdated, like feeble-minded. They also use the R word prolifically.
Which we did. That came up a lot in Willowbrook, too, where you're dealing with a lot of
rough language.
Yes.
Yeah.
They
used words like moron and the R word were actual like clinical diagnoses for your IQ level. But they also, like, epileptic was also kind of a catch-all term for somebody who would have like quote fits. So whether you were having a actual seizure or you were having perhaps like a meltdown because you're autistic and you're overstimulated, or any other number of things, like it was very much a catch-all, whoever just didn't fit into society. So
epileptic.
Yeah. A commission was formed to evaluate the number and current status of all the quote feeble-minded and epileptic people in the state to figure out how big this institution needed to be and what kind of services it needed to be capable of providing.
They were like, "Don't worry, we'll understaff it and make it supplied anyway."
Well, at the start, it wasn't it was terrible by today's standards, but at the time, it wasn't all horrific. But the search, that committee found that 1,146 people classified as, quote, feeble-minded, unquote, were living in mental hospitals, which Wikipedia called insane hospitals, which is a choice. And 2,627 feeble-minded people were living in almshouses, county care hospitals, reformatories, and prisons, all of whom this committee found were in need of specialized care. So about 3,800 people in the state needed this care and weren't, I guess theoretically, the folks who were living already in a mental hospital were in a county care hospital were potentially receiving care, but the rest of them weren't. Either way.
And even if they were receiving care, it probably wasn't good.
Yeah, we'll get to that. The initial design was for the complex to have 2 buildings, one for educational and industrial department and one for the custodial, aka, quote, asylum department. The idea being like they classified people into being able to be helped and potentially reintroduced into society, and then the people who were beyond help. So the asylum or custodial section was people who they classified as being like incurable of their feeble-mindedness or their epilepsy or whatever. Which is cool because like polio isn't curable. Like once you've had it,
right,
you just have the effects of polio. So like theoretically somebody with like cerebral palsy would be unable to be helped and put in this.
Which we saw with Willowbrook. I mean, like, yes. I can't remember what his name was, but he wound up becoming an activist. And yes. in that interview with Geraldo Rivera was like, I just want to like learn how to read better. Mm-hmm. They just like won't teach me how to be literate.
Right.
So it's just like, it's just wild, the very broad umbrella.
Yes.
That people were put under.
Right. And so the legislature, when they authorized the building of the school, they required that Pennhurst house at least 500 patients at all times, with room for additions and expansions as needed. So at the time, the treatment of disabled individuals was seen to be ideal if they were segregated from the general public and sterilized. We'll get into that in a second. There were similar hospitals already in existence that were pretty close to Pennhurst. One was called Elwyn and one was called Polk, but public health officials were concerned that those hospitals would be, quote, overwhelmed based on, quote, the rising tide of hereditary feeble-mindedness. So just keep that phrase in mind.
Wow.
So construction began in 1903, and in 1908, patient number 1 was admitted. After 4 years of operation, Pennhurst was already overcrowded, and throughout its 79 years of operation, it housed over 10,000 residents. So residents
How many years?
79.
Oh my God.
Residents were classified into 3 categories when admitted: mental, physical, and dental. Mentally...
Dental like teeth?
Yeah. Mental patients were classified as imbecile or insane. Physical patients were classified as epileptic or healthy. And teeth were classified as either good, poor, or treated.
I feel like they just picked dental because it rhymed with mental.
Potentially. Yeah, maybe.
It doesn't make any sense.
I'm pretty sure I mentioned this later, but basically, I don't know that they had a full-time dentist or if it was even technically a trained dentist. But if any patients were prone to or have found to have bitten any staff, they'd have all of their teeth removed. Every single one.
What the fuck?
So there's that.
I can't bite you with my molars.
I mean, you can, but it's more like gnawing, I guess. But yeah, no, they just take all their teeth. And it's like, when you're faced with that, it's like, okay, but this person is biting, again, like they're putting all these people together. So they're putting people who are struggling with severe mental illness, who could be struggling with psychosis and hallucinations, but you're also putting those with the same people who just don't know how to communicate and are frustrated.
Right.
And, people who are deaf or blind or have mobility issues. And so it's the kind of thing where it's like, well, okay, but like, it's not like they're taking Hannibal Lecter's teeth, like every single time. Like this person is biting, like it's the same reason like toddlers bite.
Or how many people have experienced, something traumatic and are now being like really heavily handled by people.
Yeah.
And flashing back or,
there's reports and documentation and video footage of people who were restrained to their beds and tied to their beds and kept there like they were in Willowbrook. So that's the only way you have to fight back. And so that's what's going to, anyway.
Because there's literally no autonomy in any sense.
Right. So anyway, the first structures on the property, because it was built in several stages, and it wasn't an expansive property. It was something like 1,000 acres, maybe.
Oh my God.
1,400 acres. I mean, it was a huge complex.
But also it was like that same thing where they're trying to keep people isolated.
Exactly. And they had all of these different buildings, which were super ornate, very kind of like Ohio State Reformatory that they filmed Shawshank Redemption at. Like the idea that like you build it so that it looks like this foreboding kind of nice place. So anyway, the first structures on the property were built in several stages, designed by some guy named Philip H. Johnson and made of red brick, terracotta, and granite, and were connected by fireproof tunnels with walkways on top of the tunnels to transport residents. So the tunnels were actually underground and connected all of these buildings together.
It makes me wonder like how common that was, because that's what they did with Willowbrook too. There was all those tunnels underneath.
Oh, I forgot that. I
Yeah,
didn't
that's so
realize that there were
crazy.
tunnels. It makes sense, especially
That's where
in the
that Cropsey guy
Northeast.
was hiding out
Oh, I just thought
in
he
the
was in the
tunnels.
woods.
Both.
Oh, um, it makes sense in the Northeast, especially before we started setting the planet on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'd have a lot of snow in the winter and
Yep.
it'd be really cold and icy. And Pennsylvania gets a lot of like nor'easters and clipper systems because they're close to the water.
Mm-hmm.
So it does make sense, and it makes sense for Willowbrook too. But it's just like, it's just wild to me that they were doing that long ago, because I just feel like that's
Yeah.
such an undertaking construction wise. Like if you told me now that I had to build
Right.
even like a French drain in the backyard, I'd be like, ugh, kill me. Um, the first buildings also had a steam piping system, meaning that this place theoretically had hot and cold running water in the early 1900s, which is kind of wild.
Especially for that scale.
Mm-hmm. The residences themselves were mostly made up of small rooms with 2 to 3 beds, a few small dorms with 8 to 10 beds, and then a large day room for exercise. Now, these are just the initial buildings, so it gets worse.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the theoretical design, was that that would be the setup. Um, also, the Pennsylvania Railroad, of monopoly fame, created a Pennhurst station so that coal and other supplies could be easily delivered directly to the hospital. Apparently, some of these tracks are actually still visible behind some of the buildings, and so they actually ran pretty close to several of the structures. And fun fact, you can currently walk the trail that this line ran on in the Schuylkill River Trail if you're near Spring Hill, Pennsylvania, and you want to get haunted.
Wow. Also, you think about
Yeah.
like a facility that's big enough that needs its own rail line to be able to get supplies to it. And
Yeah,
also
I know
like
it's
further that distancing them from like a
correct. Yeah, there's
neurotypical
no reason for
population.
anyone there to leave.
Right.
Everything will
Right.
come to them. Yeah. Pennhurst, it also, of course, also had its own, hospital and infirmary and morgue with a crematorium. Um, Pennhurst was considered revolutionary at the time. It was part of a growing national trend to separate folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which at the time were called um, things like defective, degenerate, unfit, or feeble minded from
Oh, Lord.
mainstream society. And if it sounds familiar, you guessed it, it's from the American eugenics movement.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So part of the reason, like you said, that Pennhurst was so secluded from the rest of the world and it was kind of built as a city unto itself is because, the white guys in charge were literally worried about intermixing the genes of the quote feeble-minded with the approved genes that they liked.
Oh, so it was even worse than like out of sight, out of mind. It was
It
literally like
was,
we don't want them commingling.
yes.
Jesus.
And I was watching something, I watched like a ton of YouTube stuff. And somebody claimed that the feeble-minded woman was the most dangerous of them all because she could blend into society and procreate at will, basically. Like, whatever. So so this is the reason ultimately that the campus was designed with a separate female ward to keep also the sexes separated from each other, at least as far as the patients were concerned, while on the campus. At the time, Pennhurst's chief physician quoted, this was like in 1918, quoted Dr. Henry H. Goddard, a leading eugenicist, in the physician's biennial report to the legislature, which said, quote, "Every feeble-minded person is a potential criminal." The report went
Damn.
on to say,
It's
and
a
this
hot
whole thing is
take.
a, yeah, that was what the eugenicist said. That was his thing. But anyway, so
Well,
this
shock.
report goes on to say, and this is a huge block of text, but it's a quote and it's just fucking wild. It says, "The general public, although more convinced today than ever before that it is a good thing to segregate the idiot or the distinct imbecile, they have not as yet been convinced as to the proper treatment of the defective delinquent, which is the brighter and more dangerous individual. It is now generally understood that feeble-mindedness is in the great majority of instances the direct result of hereditary transmission of mental defect. It is also known that the feeble-minded female is very likely to bear children and that these children are almost certain to be defective or in some way permanently dependent. The feeble-minded girl is more of a menace to society than the feeble-minded boy. Statistics show that feeble-minded girls and boys marry in the ratio of 3 to 1. It would seem, therefore, that if the state is not adequately equipped to care for all of the feeble-minded girl should have institutional care in preference to the boy, since she is the greater menace.
I mean, don't get me wrong. The thought of being called a menace to society and scaring men that much I respect it.
It is a life goal.
Yes. But also, what the fuck?
Also, what I'm hearing is that normies prefer marrying a feeble-minded woman. Like, that's what I'm hearing. They like that this woman is not able to express her will and exercise her free will as much, and therefore they marry at a ratio of 3 to 1. Like, that's what I'm hearing. Like, and at the time in the 1918s, women didn't necessarily have to work and didn't have to work in a way that required like mental exertion. Like, you could go work in a factory and be fine. But yeah, so that was his report to the legislature. And effectively, it was the reason for this report to say this was because they wanted to be authorized to build this separate female colony on the campus. Also, fun fact, because I went down a little bit of a eugenics rabbit hole. Charles Lindbergh was a huge eugenicist.
Yeah.
And it's why many people think that he orchestrated the kidnapping of his own son, even though the murder was unintentional, they think, because it's believed that Lindbergh thought his son had some sort of congenital defect. Lindbergh is also famously moved to Germany after the Nazis took power in 1935, and apparently went absolutely apeshit on the whole Lebensborn thing, which is the Nazi ideal of breeding the perfect human specimen, which Lindbergh and eugenicists were all about. But anyway, the Nazis, being Nazis about it is pretty much the reason that eugenics went out of favor in America for the most part, except for now, if you're following our politics. So
it turns out they found some merit to it.
Yeah. Which is interesting because what's his face in Texas would have been taken out by eugenics.
Abbott.
Yeah, Abbott.
Yeah.
Between 1908 and 1987, when Pennhurst closed, 10,500 people resided at Pennhurst. At its peak, I've heard different numbers, but 3,500 to 4,100 people were in custodial care at Pennhurst at a single time. And as a reminder, it was originally designed to house 500 people. Later on, I believe the max capacity was like 1,900 people. So even with that, it was like
they're still way over capacity.
Yeah, more than double what it was supposed to be. And that was just for like beds, not counting like they just did not have the staff.
Oh yeah.
So in 1966,
or the supplies, food, clothing, sheets, toothbrushes.
Right. So in 1966, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act, which authorized the provision of some services in community settings, among some other things. So up until that point, you could only be institutionalized. You had to be in this like permanent housing situation if you were seen as mentally ill or developmentally disabled or physically disabled. I guess if you were physically disabled, it was kind of like up to your families, but the gist that I was getting was that because this was run by the state, a lot of orphans and people who were taken from their families ended up there because they had a lower IQ, which we'll get into, but it's like very plausible that these people with lower IQ just weren't being made to go to school. So
Mhm.
they couldn't read or couldn't read to their age level, and therefore they were deemed to be stupid.
Or behavioral problems, or I mean, there's just
Yeah.
like so many like small arbitrary things that I feel like could land you
Yeah.
in this type of setting.
Mhm. During the Christmas season of 1965, a artist, I don't know if he was an artist, but his friend was a photographer. Burton Blatt was a participant in a research project at a Connecticut Center for the Developmentally Disabled when he undertook a bold venture. He and his friend, a photographer named Fred Kaplan, gained access to 5 state institutions for the developmentally disabled in 4 eastern states. At the time, Mr. Kaplan was carrying a miniature spy camera on his belt and was taking pictures while they toured the wards in
Oh
these
shit.
facilities. So apparently they were moved to despair over what they had documented, and the two men self-published a book called Christmas in Purgatory in 1966. They printed 1,000 copies and distributed them free of charge to legislators, university professors, and fledgling mental health advocacy groups at the time. It was the first time that many Americans had seen the horrors of institutional life, and response to the book was so remarkable that Christmas in Purgatory was selected for print by Allen and Bacon publishers later that year. To protect those affiliated with the project, Blatt and Kaplan never disclosed the names of the institutions they visited, so it's not known whether Pennhurst was among them. But what is certain is that Pennhurst was not unique. There's a website called preservingpennhurst.org where I got this information and a bunch of my other information, and they have some of the photos from Christmas in Purgatory, and they are horrible. There are people who are completely naked. There was somebody like really thin who was like squatted down, almost like you were going to do like a leapfrog move.
Mm-hmm.
So he's on his feet but squatted down and was like clearly shimmying, kind of like shuffling across the floor like that on his feet.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that was clear because there was a trail of waste behind him.
Oh my god.
And there was like a huge puddle of waste in the corner further behind him. And there were several pictures that were similar like that of very clearly other people. And their faces are blacked out, their eyes are blacked out, and their genitals are blacked out. But it is there's like 10 photos on that website, and they're very graphic, really. So also in 1966, the US took a major step toward being a country that potentially cares for its citizens with the initiation the initiation of the federal Medicare program, which I didn't realize started that late, but I guess makes sense.
Yeah, I thought that was like a New Deal thing.
No, that was just Social Security.
Social Security was New Deal.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
One provision of the new federal program provided that state-operated facilities for developmentally delayed or disabled individuals were eligible for federal reimbursement for a portion of their operating costs, which was eventually codified into the Intermediate Care Facility / Mental Retardation Program. And I believe that that's still in effect today. So basically, the federal government is like subsidizing the care for individuals in these hospital or institutional settings. Now we get to the original Geraldo Rivera. In 1968, Bill Baldini from local news station NBC 10.
What a name.
Right? I wrote, much like our mustachioed friend would do about 10 years later.
Bill Baldini?
Mm-hmm.
I love
it. Researched and published an explosive video expose on the Pennhurst State School called Suffer the Little Children, based on the Bible quote. The link to this video is in our show notes. It's also on YouTube. You just type in Suffer the Little Children. Both the link in the show notes and the one on YouTube, it's like a compilation because it was a 5-part like series in the nightly news. And then there was like a follow-up done like 30 years later by the same news channel with Bill Baldini and all this other stuff. So it's like all compiled together. So yeah, it's very cool. It's just from the 60s, so the audio is kind of like splotchy. So just like if you're using headphones, just be aware so that you don't accidentally hurt your ears.
Same thing for this episode as I'm flopping around trying to get comfortable on my bed.
Like I said, so the video, like I said, is in our show notes. But just be aware that they freely use the R word. It was a diagnostic word at that point. It's not being used as a slur. Just be aware that if you're going to listen, like there's no swearing or anything, but if you're going to listen around children, like you might have to explain that we don't use
like
that
at the
word.
time it was a medical term.
Correct. So the documentary starts with Baldini saying in the 18th century, these people were ignored, punished, or exploited. Today, things are supposed to be different. Modern 20th century man is much more scientific and civilized. Today, we no longer punish the mentally retarded. We no longer exploit them either. We have come a long, long way. Now we ship them 25 miles out of town to a state-operated institution and forget them while they decay from neglect. Damn. Unquote.
Tell him, Bill.
Yeah. They had video footage. And so they were just fully given access. I don't know if it was like Geraldo Rivera where he kind of like snuck in. But he had camera crews and was like recording on the campus. Like this statement was said like in front of one of the buildings into a microphone. So they had multiple images of people who were tied to beds. They were tied to beds with like white fabric. They were also tied to bed with those like big leather bulky restraints. There were people who had some sort of mobility issue, I would say, like almost like club footing was shown a lot, but I don't know if it was like a contracture or like actually just being born with a club foot. And they describe in the expose, they described grown people living in, quote, cages, cribs, and beds. These people were half clothed or not clothed, shoeless, and were stimming alone on a concrete floor. Lots of rocking back and forth, lots of like auditory shouting or stimming. And the expose was titled Suffer the Little Children because the staff of Pennhurst called all residents children, regardless of their age or abilities, which I think it's not mentioned in the documentary, but they did not separate people by age. They only separated them by sex. So a child would be in the same dormitory as a grown adult. And so they had children who never didn't learn to walk or crawl until they were like 5 or 6 because they didn't have the staff to teach them how to walk.
Right.
Because similar to Willowbrook, it would be one aide for every 100 patients.
Yep.
And they'd have a whole floor of them, and it just is what it is. Like it's
right.
And
it's like Willowbrook, they had a problem with there's a lot of people who wound up with like a pneumonia because they were eating food that was like basically just like liquid, and they were feeding themselves, and they're aspirating food, and they're not getting moved around, and they're laying in these beds for how long with inappropriate clothing that's not good for like the season. So I mean, these drafty old buildings,
right, exactly,
with all this like tile floor, like there's just no like warmth, comfort, security. I mean, you think about things like on such a fundamental level, like self, like being able to take care of yourself and feed yourself, and
learn how to take care of yourself if that's where you've lived your whole life. And they say in the documentary, in 1908 they were put here as a lost cause, and then they've never left. So in 1968, 60 years they've lived there and never left. So if you're never taught how to brush your own teeth or wash yourself, then what are you going to do? And we'll get into it. So at the time of the expose, there were about 2,800 residents. And they were there were only 9 medical doctors and 2 psychiatrists working there full time for the
For
2,800.
2,900 people?
Mm-hmm.
My God.
There were at the time 900 female patients at Pennhurst, but no gynecologist on the full-time staff. The expose
Which
noted
they probably
that,
weren't worrying about because they were just sterilizing everybody.
yes, they did that quite a bit. The expose also noted that many doctors were forced to act beyond their expertise. One doctor who was interviewed on camera extensively, I'm pretty sure his last name was Fear, Fear, but it might have been Freer. But I don't know, again, because the audio was like kind of grainy.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. But I was like, if your name is Dr. Fear, like, what the fuck? But anyway, he was interviewed on camera and was talking about having to deal with patients with behavioral issues. And he was a medical doctor, I'm pretty sure. And he might have been a psychologist, dealing with people with behavioral issues, and stated that on camera that it was helpful to degrade the patient when he's not behaving and lock him in a cottage, aka residence building, with quote with autistic and hyperactive patients to offend their dignity, unquote. And they kept using the phrase hyperactive, and I was like, oh, so like we would have been there. Like, cool.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we talked about in both of these is like with that broad umbrella, you think about how many, like if somebody really, if they had a child or a family member that they really wanted to send away,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could really contrive it where there's so many different diagnoses that would get you there.
Yes. And because at the time, I was watching something else on YouTube that was like, they would just put on the death certificate cause of death insanity,
Oh my
because
God.
that was the diagnosis. And so they would just like, you could cover up whatever you wanted to.
Right.
And then they would cremate the body and send it back home to the family if they had any.
Yeah.
And so
Or
it's
probably put it
cremated.
in a mass grave.
So, right. So there's nothing to say that these people weren't resultant. And so we'll get into it in a second. But in response to this, like, you know, it's helpful if you offend their dignity. Baldini said, well, you're offending their dignity by putting somebody with an IQ of 69 in a cottage with children who have an IQ of 10 and are severely handicapped. He didn't say handicapped, but are severely handicapped. So that's how you lower their dignity. Do you find this is an effective measure? And the doctor replied, that is correct. We have found it in some cases to be effective, but in other cases, it doesn't work out. And Baldini said, doesn't it degrade the person to the point that he may digress? And the doctor replied, what we're trying to do is degrade him against his fellows here because they make fun of him about it for a while. But I don't think there's anything inhumane about it or anything of that sort. Yes. So,
wow, really logical.
Yeah, and they were talking specifically about this patient named Johnny with the IQ of 69. And he would be put into this, what they would fully call a punishment ward. And then another YouTube video I watched was saying how, in addition to being housed with these people in these punishment wards, you would also be responsible for like helping to care for the patients who lived there. So like you would be cleaning the toilets and like cleaning up after, like scrubbing the floors for these patients where there just wasn't enough staff to begin with. And then they were using the other patients to take care of these other residents who were more disabled as a form of punishment to degrade them. And basically the doctor was like, yeah, because then when they finally get to go back to their regular dorm, they get called the R word by their staff or by their peers, because it's like, oh, are you so, stupid that you had to go live there and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, which is like kind of a natural thing, but it's also that sort of thing where like
Wild.
Lord of the Flies, like
right.
the people who live there, they're just trying to survive. And if that's the way they can survive and like kind of gain favor with the staff members who are there by reinforcing what the staff member is doing and like making the staff member feel better about their choices or whatever. Like, I'm sure there's a deep psychological well there. But this doctor also admitted to drugging patients with pentobarbital who were too hyperactive. And They would also use what is it? Trazodone?
Tramadol?
Maybe the one for like seizure medication.
Oh no, I don't know.
I know I mentioned it in the elephant episode on Patreon. But it's like a tranquilizer, and they would give it to these people, but it's often used to treat epilepsy to like stop a seizure. But with these medications, you can actually like cause somebody to develop a seizure disorder or induce a severe seizure because you're giving it to them too often, because they're not supposed to have, like, it's the same with any other medication. If you're taking a medication you're not supposed to have, you can be in deep shit. And so then we go back to that whole thing where somebody's death certificate says they died of insanity or they died of mental retardation, and it's just this blanket statement that covers whatever. And then the body is cremated, so there's no way to know. They're, they're not going to do a tox screen. They don't even probably have the staff to do a tox screen if they even were willing. So there's also this, but the way, I mean, I highly recommend watching the video on it, because the way that this doctor was just talking about it was like not even cavalier. It was almost like he was bored of the questions. Like he was just like, yeah, of course that's what we do. Like, so.
Well, because I'm sure too, there's definitely an element of like burnout, like they're just burned out on.
Yeah.
Like there's no empathy left. Like they just, if they had empathy to begin with, there's definitely none of it left when there's, how many of them to 2,900 patients.
Right. Yeah. I mean, 9 doctors to.
And I don't even mean it in a sympathetic way. I think just like it's like when you see like police officers that have completely separated like humans from the population that they're serving. Where it's like you're not even seeing people as people anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. They see them. Yeah.
And it's dangerous. Like that's setting.
Yes.
That's a recipe for a disaster.
It causes extreme suffering in every instance that happens. In every context that we see that happen, it causes extreme suffering.
Yes.
So they also interviewed the patient that they were talking about there, Johnny, with the IQ of 69. He was an actual child, like maybe 12 years old.
Oh my God.
They put him on camera, but they did cover his eyes with an eye mask to protect his privacy. But he was like having a conversation, and he was like, "No, I don't like it here. I want to leave." But they were like, "Okay, well, if you left, like, where would you want to go?" And he was like, didn't answer. And so then Baldini was like, "Do you remember living anywhere before Pennhurst?" And he was like, "Nope."
Oh my God.
And like he has no family.
Oh my God.
And they showed the ward that he was sent to as punishment, and that was the ward where people are rocking in a corner, screaming. These are extremely nonverbal individuals, people who need significant help caring for themselves. And that's where he was put. And he's like, "Well, I don't mind it because the people talk to me here, but I know that I'm only here because I didn't do what they wanted me to do."
Oh my God.
And it was like, it's just, I mean, it was a baby, like maybe 12 years old. He was so little. And according to Dr. Fear, these patients, Johnny came from parents that were delinquents themselves. They did not have and the boy did not have proper education.
Were they delinquents or were they just poverty stricken?
Well, that's just it. And I was like, it sounds like he was taken from his parents by the state, which is like obviously a clusterfuck of a problem in and of itself. Right. Like, I don't have enough, right? Like I have no information on his biological parents, to know whether they were actually bad parents or had drug addictions or were just guilty of being poor. So like I cannot possibly pass judgment on them. But either way, it sounds like Johnny was made a ward of the state and was permanently sent to live at Pennhurst, and that he probably just had trouble reading. Like it goes back to that thing of, whatever his parents were dealing with, if Johnny just wasn't, like if he had dyslexia and was struggling in school and then was acting out and therefore was like behind, then yeah, it's going to seem. And at one point, Dr. Fear said, because Baldini was like, okay, so like, let's say this person with an IQ of 69, you're putting him in a room with somebody with the IQ of 30, like how do you expect him to progress? And he was like, well, the IQ is relative. And I was like, he didn't say relative to what? And I was like, is it relative to like how much education you give them? Because I would argue that's probably, if you're using people to like, if that's how you're gauging it,
Right. And like,
then
who is this supposed to help?
I also saw something that,
or is it just like taking people off your plate so you don't have to deal with them for, a month or however long you're putting them together?
I mean, probably that.
Yeah.
I saw this other thing where somebody was saying that they gave the same like IQ test to every patient that came through the doors. And in 1980, Stephen Hawking would have gotten an IQ of 3 because he was unable to speak or hold a pencil without assistive technology.
Holy shit.
Right. So it's like you're not actually gauging the intelligence of these people or their ability even.
I mean, how arbitrary are these?
I mean, yeah.
The IQ tests anyway, you know what I mean?
And they're super racist.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a BMI, it's just ridiculous.
And it's, I mean, there's like different types of intelligence. Like there's people who spatially are really intelligent or logically very intelligent, or I mean,
oh, totally. And it's the kind of thing where it's like if you're not nurturing any version of intelligence with any of these patients, other than like survivalist intelligence, and like they are just doing what they need to get, day to day. But this doctor also admitted that Pennhurst did not have the programs necessary to help Johnny progress to a quote normal status where he could be released. But he said like, oh well, I tried to get him into a Christian school up the road, but his IQ is too low. So like they can't even get him to like, again, like the reading level. They can't get him to the point where he could be transferred to an actual school.
We can't.
Right.
It's weird when we completely neglect them. They don't progress. I don't know.
Well, and part of this documentary, they I think it's the second day of it, they talk about how in 1968, the largest zoos for animals in the country spent $7.15 per day on the care of each one of their animals. Pennhurst spent $5.90 per day for the care of each of its patients, with 80% of that $5.90 paying the administrative costs of Pennhurst, which left just 75 cents to actually care for the patients per day. 75 cents a day. It's like those fucking ads for Christian Children's Fund.
Yeah.
Like the rated capacity of Pennhurst in 1980 was 1,984, and in 1968, the current residents were 2,791.
Oh my God.
So just about 900 over capacity.
Which, like, when you're dealing with people with a varying degree of needs, but like a higher level of needs.
Yes.
That's extreme. Mm-hmm. It's extreme. I mean, that would be extreme for, people that didn't need anything assistive.
Well, and I think it's also important to note that the rated capacity of these institutions is like the number of beds they had.
Right.
Not the number of staff they had.
Right.
So it's the kind of thing like the hotel has a capacity of this many, but they have 3 housekeepers, but like you can have 4,000 people in the hotel. Like good luck.
And Willowbrook had a hard time with staffing because when you get people in that do genuinely care and do want to help, they either quit or get fired because they're not going to change anything. And if they're too much of a squeaky wheel, they get fired. So it's just like, well, like it's just, it is really, like they talk about like bad apple. Like this isn't bad apple. This is like bad barrel. Like the whole barrel's bad.
Yeah. The Pennhurst State School is often called the shame of Pennsylvania.
Oh my God.
For this reason. They spoke with Baldini interviewed the superintendent of Pennhurst, who said that he would like to have 1,500 staff total, meaning that the total number of staff would need to basically double, which would require $4 million per year to pay for that staff. They talked to the building manager, who said that you can't touch a building to make any repairs unless you're willing to spend like $1 million, because they're so old and they would need so much work. They admitted that if there was a building inspection, the buildings would be closed. There was black mold everywhere, semi-collapsed ceilings from water damage, exposed pipes, chipped paint. Also, like, this was very much like asbestos city and lead paint central. So, like, do with that information what you will. The building manager also said that he had done a requisition request for bras for the female patients. And on the justification for the requisition request on the form, he filled it in as saying self-evident. And like you could tell he was like horrified that he had to explain this to the
Yeah.
reporter, because he's like a man in the 60s having to talk about a bra, and he kept calling them brassiers. But so he filled it in as self-evident. And then that request was denied, along with like several other requests for requisitions. And the reason for the denial was that it required more info. So he had a doctor basically write a prescription for bras for the patients.
Oh my God.
And the request was still denied.
Oh my God.
Like,
Can you imagine having to get a prescription for your bra? Actually, sometimes I feel like I do need a prescription.
yeah, I was like, actually, if my insurance would cover my bras, that wouldn't be so bad. It's DME, right?
I feel like it is. Oh my God. That's awful.
Dear Chuck Schumer, please pay for my bras.
Please add my need for boulder holders to the Affordable Care Act. What do they call that? Like the
durable medical equipment?
No, the minimum that a plan has to include.
Oh, I don't know what it's called.
There's like a phrase for it.
They should be like FSA eligible or something.
They should.
Yeah.
They're so expensive.
I know. So the expose did highlight some programs that Pennhurst had for blind and deaf residents, as well as some vocational programs that allowed patients to learn a skill. By the sounds of it, these programs were like somewhat effective, but I think
like skill should be
they were for people who their only quote problem, was that they were blind or deaf, or potentially had a little bit of like a learning delay or a speech delay. I think based on everything that I read and watched, like the staff at Pennhurst could help folks who just needed to like learn like fine motor skills or something. They could handle that. It was when that was like coupled with behavioral issues or mental health issues or severe mobility limitations, that when there was like no real ability to communicate with the patient, that's when things fell apart. And unfortunately, most of the residents of Pennhurst had multiple things that they were dealing with and that needed treatment.
Well, and even then, like if you're constantly putting out fires, how much time are you going to be able to sit and work on someone's fine motor skills?
Also, just only 7% of the total number of patients were enrolled in the rehabilitation projects.
7%.
Yeah, 7
Jesus.
of the 2,800. So like 200 people.
Oh my God. Ever.
Right. Not ever, I guess, just at the time of the documentary.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, at a time, they could only do 200 patients to get actual like acute care, basically.
And even then, it's like, I don't know how much I buy it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that is a self-reported thing.
Yeah. Trying to make themselves look good with a hot 7%.
Yeah. There's also reports, of course, like you had in Willowbrook, of patients being punished if their family members tried to get them better care, if their family members complained. But a lot of patients were simply just never visited by family. They were just left there. And again, like, I think part of that is the time where they were told, you know, these people need to be separated from society. They don't belong with us. You know, they were, you know, a mistake, quote unquote. And then part of it is a lot of these families just did not have the skills. Like they knew that they were out of their depth. And there's significant privilege in being able to personally care for somebody with extreme medical needs, and not having to have them in an inpatient facility of any kind. The doctor that we talked about before also described, like, with a weird amount of pride, punishing a patient who was, I guess he like hit another patient So he punished the patient that started the fight by, quote, injecting him with the most painful injection they had that wouldn't do any harm to the patient. Yeah. And like, I guess his comment, the patient said to him, like, oh, well, what are you going to do about it? Like, you can't touch me. And he was like, the doctor's response was, by the end of the day, you'll learn what I can do. And then at 7 p.m., apparently coaxed him into voluntarily lying down on the bed and then injected him with this, whatever it was. He didn't say what it was, but it was something painful that apparently wouldn't do harm. So I think Dr. Fear was a psychologist and was asking the medical doctor, what can I inject him with? So, yeah.
That's nuts.
Mm-hmm.
That's so sadistic.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing, it kind of goes back to our medical bias episodes where we're talking about how like a lot of it is learned by like medical students learn it from their teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And my neighbor's dog is going nuts. So if you can hear that, sorry.
No, I don't hear it.
Oh, good. But it's that kind of thing where, you know, the psychologist says to the MD, can you know, what can I inject this person with without hurting them? Basically, like, how hard can I hit them without leaving a mark is the question he was asking. And the medical doctor was like, oh, this is the answer to that question. Like, without, I guess, contemplating the fact that he was going to use that information to actually harm somebody. Like, what? It's just fucking wild. So while this whole thing was airing, the main desk anchor at NBC 10 had an interview with then Vice President Hubert Humphrey and mentioned to Vice President Humphrey this expose that was going on and like asked his opinion on it. So apparently Hubert Humphrey's first granddaughter was born disabled. And his description of her was, quote, she is a beautiful child and we've seen what can be done with love and care and specialized training.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. It was very sweet to hear him talk about it. He noted that they are privileged and they can afford to send their granddaughter to a private school, but, quote, not everyone is so lucky and not everyone can do that, which I thought was also very, like, progressive.
Yeah, mind blown. I mean, it sounds like something somebody would be saying today.
Exactly. And so he also stated, he said that you will never have love returned to you the way love is returned by a disabled child, calling it God's true love. He said, I get more joy out of our little Vicky than I have ever experienced. He said, if you can care for a child at home, that's the best place, but there are many that can't, and they need institutional care. He also said that state legislatures must remember that every child is entitled to all care and protection that you can give that child. And he said a disabled child is entitled to all the education that you can give a normal child. And he may not be able to learn as much as a normal child, but he is entitled to get as much as he can get. Wow. He said school systems must have specialized systems for the mentally disturbed and the mentally challenged. And he said, quote, if it's not good, then it's shameful because this is a great country and this is a rich country, which is very great and very rich and has no excuse.
Damn.
I know, like scathing review, but it was like, it was just so interesting what his response was, because it was like you would never hear that from a politician today.
Right,
like,
right.
Like it was so direct.
And even in his, in the language that he was using was like, it wasn't, you think about how much of this language has been like very, again, like lacking empathy. Whereas when he's talking about things, he's like very empathetic in the way he's speaking. Wow.
Yeah.
Mind blown. Again.
Yeah. And I mean, I think at one point he did say in the interview, like, you know, I didn't know until I had this granddaughter.
Yeah.
So, you know, even he acknowledged, like, if you had tried to talk to me about this, you know, 15 years ago, I would have given you a totally different opinion. Like, he didn't come out and say that. But
which is how life is supposed to be.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be something where like you experience things and it changes your opinion.
Right. And that's totally normal. And
yeah,
you know, it's
healthy.
You know, #growth.
Yeah.
And like,
well, it's like when people are on politicians about flip-flopping, like, no, they should be changing their opinions when they learn new information or experience something that changes their perspective.
Right. And yeah, it was a very direct way of saying everything. And it was just it's just extremely poignant, and you could tell he like loves his granddaughter and like just thinks like she's the bee's knees. So it was just very interesting. So after this documentary aired, or this expose, there was obviously public outcry, which eventually resulted in the state of Pennsylvania pouring $16 million into Pennhurst, which was used for more staff, better food, appropriate clothing, and fun frivolities like toilet paper. That was
Bed
me.
sheets.
I editorialized that last one.
But that's, I mean, it's like at Willowbrook when that one doctor was like, they need to be eating food that's not moldy.
Right.
Like the food that you're trying to serve them is rotten, and they can't.
The
be
female
rotten
patients
food.
should have a gynecologist. Like they should have a doctor,
right,
capable of examining female anatomy.
right.
And like, yeah. Despite the expose, though, things didn't really change very much. Injuries were super common. They continued to be common, especially, again, due to the lack of staff. In January 1977, there were 833 minor and 25 major injuries reported.
Oh my God. In 1 year?
I think it was in a month.
What?
Yeah, because it says just January 1977.
Jesus Christ.
I mean, either way, like even for a year,
it's still nuts.
It's like half your population has an injury.
Right.
On January 8th, 1975, a patient was reported to have bit off 3/4 of a patient's earlobe while the other resident was asleep. Not too long after this, another patient
they Mike Tyson'd.
Mm-hmm. Not too long after this, another patient was reported to have pushed a resident onto the floor so hard that the resident who was pushed died. Yes.
Holy shit.
But this is also what happens when you house people together who, like, some people are handicapped and are mentally and developmentally challenged, and then other people are just mentally ill. And when you have those groups mixing together, and also vast age ranges,
right,
you're going to have these types of incidences, particularly when they're also not being supervised or watched or cared for.
Right. And I mean, like we were just talking about this the other day, my spouse and I, when you look at like houseless people that are experiencing sleep deprivation, because how well are you actually sleeping when you don't have a safe place to sleep?
Oh yeah, and that's true.
How much mental illness is exacerbated by sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
So it's just like a cycle. So you look at this, like, if your basic needs are not being met, how much, and you're not sleeping well, you're not, like, your schedule isn't being regulated, you're not eating nutritional food, like you're probably, I mean, how many other medical conditions could they possibly have that aren't being treated? And how much is that like just exasperating any symptoms that they have? Right. It just turns into this like cyclical thing where it just gets worse. Like they just devolve over time.
Yeah, it becomes this like whirlpool of quicksand where like you just are drowning and you can't get out. And it's that thing of like, what did you expect? Like when you treat people like this. So I mean, there was still, significant staffing shortages. And, 10 years after this documentary aired, there was, the problems either resurfaced or, never went away. And unless that $16 million is going to continue to get renewed by the legislature, then, and I think especially when it comes to the care of the, less living, quote unquote, the less valuable to society, it's very easy to be like, okay, we fixed it, goodbye. And then
just do the same thing.
They check off the list and then it goes away and it's never handled again. Rather than seen as a continuing line item. Like,
we gave you
potholes.
toothbrushes 5 years ago. What do you want?
Yeah, exactly.
How many clothes do you need?
Truly. And there was actually, to some extent, I get it, but there was footage of children moving into a new dorm and they were like carrying their clothes with them, and they like put a pile of clothes on the table and then each kid just went over and grabbed a shirt. So like they didn't have stuff of their own, which on the one hand I understand, because if you're washing all of these clothes, like washing them and then getting them back to the patient would be like such a fucking undertaking.
Right.
But it was also just one of those things where it was like, you get what you get. Hopefully the shirt you picked out doesn't have a hole in it, kind of thing. So in any event, in 1971, the Pennsylvania ARC chapter filed a lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania seeking access to education for all children. The lawsuit challenged the constitutionality of excluding children with intellectual disabilities from public schools, which, if you've ever seen Forrest Gump, is what happened. Like, that's why the start of that movie, that's why she was fighting and slept with the principal to keep her son in school, because otherwise he would have been institutionalized, because there were no special needs classes or special education classes in public schools at all in the 1970s.
Yeah, because everybody was put in institutional settings like this.
Right, because it just fully was not covered by public schooling.
And
so
I just
either
saw a headline that Florida still does that. Florida does not have kids integrated into regular schools. I mean, like,
tracks.
Not a big surprise, but also, like, what fucking year is it?
Well, in Florida, it's 1968.
Yes.
So in 1971, the Pennsylvania ARC filed this lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of excluding children with intellectual disabilities from public school, because current state law assigned the education responsibility for such children, the children with disabilities, to the Department of Public Welfare. And as a result of the exclusion from public school, the lawsuit alleged that large number of children with disabilities were institutionalized while school-aged. The suit was eventually settled in 1972 via a consent decree, which just means that the judge also signs off on it. But that consent decree became a model for the National Right to Education law that was passed in 1974.
Wow.
Yeah. So on December 7th, 1973, there was a case of Souter v. Brennan. The United States Supreme Court upheld a lower court determination that the minimum wage and overtime compensation provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act applied to persons residing in state-operated facilities for persons with mental retardation and mental illness who provide work that would otherwise be done by paid employees. So this is the thing. It happens currently with American prisons as well, but where they have these vocational programs and then they sell those products to the general public. The Supreme Court found that you have to actually pay the residents minimum wage. You can't just have them do this and say they're getting experience. And so, but it wasn't until 1973 that like institutions in America. So part of this ruling puts an end to peonage, the practice of using unpaid labor of residents to operate facilities such as Pennhurst, which then made the continuing operation of those types of facilities more expensive because they couldn't internally subsidize it. Oh, I know. Like that, they were like, well, wait a minute, where are we going to get all our money from? And apparently, again, according to that preservepennhurst.org website, some of the residents were making like gorgeous wicker furniture, like gorgeous. Then they were just selling it and not getting paid to make it. It's just fucking wild. And like, yeah, I'm sure that the residents benefited from having something to fucking do, because who wouldn't? But like, yeah. So anyway, this required that they have to pay them. Also, side note, Goodwill does not pay their disabled employees minimum wage because they are not a state-run institution and they don't have to. So don't shop at Goodwill.
Everything.
So that brings us to the 1974 class action lawsuit filed in federal court on behalf of former and current Pennhurst residents against the institution, the superintendents, and state officials responsible for Pennhurst's operation. And that's where we'll pick up next week.
Ooh, that sounds good. I can't wait. Good job.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's just we're exactly halfway through my notes, so and we're
I mean, I know like when I was doing Willowbrook, I had to really try and condense things because there's just so much.
Yeah, and this goes on for until it continues. So there's a lot of information, and yeah, it's just crazy. And like I said, preservepennhurst.org is a great resource. And I'll talk more about it next week. But yeah. So until then, don't be an asshole. And you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at The Bar is Ankle High. We have merch at bit.ly/ankle high merch. We are on Patreon at patreon.com/The Bar is Ankle High. And right now, all Anklet and Limbo Champion subscribers will get access to ad-free episodes while Garrett is on maternity leave, which will probably be ending soon as you're hearing this. And so get in there. And leave us a 5-star review.
Yeah.
Wherever you can find us, share us with your friends, share us with your enemies, share us with your frenemies. Am I missing anything?
I don't think so. No, I think you covered all the bases then.
All right.
Friends, enemies, and frenemies. We're good.
Yeah. So yeah, in the meantime,
fight the power.
Fight the power. And we'll see you next week for more crazy information. Because the bar is ankle high.